Welcome back, my friends. Some frozen forests do not hide monsters. They hide old wars. And sometimes, the creature watching from beyond the snow is not waiting to kill you. It is waiting to see what you are becoming. The Lantern Field. In the second week of November, a state trooper named Delia Hobbs photographed a bull moose standing upright in 5 feet of snow with its ribs opened outward like the doors of a cabinet, and not 1 pound of meat taken off it. She counted the tracks around the animal before the wind ruined them. 19 sets. All the same size. All of them walking the same direction, single file, in a circle about 40 feet across, the way a rope lies when somebody coils it neatly and sets it down. She showed me the photo in the back of the post office at Kelvitt Crossing after I came home and asked me what makes a circle like that. I told her I had never seen anything like it in 26 years of guiding. That was the first lie I told about that winter. It was nowhere close to the last. My name is Eli Marston. I ran hunts and surveyed trips and river charters in the country between the Chilliwack River and the Vashik Range from the time I was 19. I know where the ice goes bad on the sloughs in April. I know the 3 passes you can take through the Vashik without a plane and the one you cannot. I have carried out 2 bodies and left 1 behind. I am telling you all of this so you understand that I am not a man who scares easy, and I am not a man who confuses a hard winter with something else. 9 of us went up the Chilliwack in October under a contract called Fallow Gate. I was the only human from Fallow Gate who walked out in March. I want to say something about a dog before I go any further, because if you stop listening at some point, I want you to at least have heard this part. His name was Bishop. 11 years old, gray through the shoulders, 1 blue eye, my lead dog for 6 seasons. He woke for Raven's Landing in a spruce 200 yards off. He woke if I rolled over. In January, camped alone in country where there was no living man inside 60 miles, something came into my camp in the night and tied a small brass bell into the fur behind Bishop's ear. He did not wake up. I did not wake up. I know it was not a dream, because I still have the bell. Let me go back to October and tell it in order. That's the only way I found to say it without stopping. The contract came through a man named Merrick Quaid, who called me on the satellite phone at the lodge and talked for 6 minutes without once telling me who he worked for. He had a flat, careful voice, the kind that has been trained out of an accent. He said there was a predator control operation going into the upper Chilliwack drainage. He said the state had subcontracted it. He said they needed a guide who knew the country north of Hollow Pass, and that my name had come up 3 times. I asked what they were controlling. He said, wolves mostly. I remember laughing at him. I remember exactly where I was standing when I did it, by the window with the bad seal, watching my yard. I said there hadn't been a wolf tracked in that drainage since spring. I said the whole system had gone quiet in a way I didn't like. No wolf sign. No fresh bear scrapes on the survey cabins. Ravens thin on the ground when ravens are never thin on the ground. I told him that if he wanted to control wolves, he'd better find some first. There was a pause on his end, and then he said, "That's more or less the problem. They paid me $11,000 for the season." I want to be honest about that, because people always want the story where the guide had a bad feeling and went anyway out of duty. I went because my roof was going, and I was 51 years old, and the charter business had been dying for 6 years. I also went because of my brother, but that comes later. They flew in on the 18th of October in a beaver on wheel skis, piloted by a man named Rudy Voss, who later told 2 different agencies that he never made that flight. 8 of them stepped out onto the gravel at Kelvitt Crossing, and I want you to know them, because the rest of this is going to happen to them. Merrick Quaid was the lead. 50s, gray at the temples, moved like a man who had been shot at professionally. He carried a rifle he clearly knew how to use, and a small black notebook he wrote in twice a day, always at the same times, which is a habit I have only ever seen in people who are reporting to somebody. Dr. Odette Lorne was the biologist. Small, sharp, 40-ish, a laugh that came out of her like a hiccup and surprised everybody, including her. She smoked hand-rolled cigarettes in weather that should have made that impossible. She told us she was a contractor out of Fairbanks doing tissue sampling on the wolf population. That was also a lie, but hers was more complicated than mine. Booker Tallis ran the dogs with me. 62 years old, hands like a bundle of hardware, 3 fingers on the left that never straightened after a hook accident in the 90s. Booker had run the Kuskokwim Mail Trail as a kid and could tell you what a team was thinking from 100 yards by the set of their tails. He and I had known each other 20 years and had maybe 11 real conversations in that time, which for Booker counted as intimacy. Nadine Voke was the shooter. Quiet, left-handed, a face that didn't move much. She kept a photograph of a girl about 9 years old in the lid pocket of her pack and never once mentioned her. She checked her rifle at the same times every day, the way other people check a watch. Gil Prada was the medic. Heavy, warm, funny. An alcoholic 6 years dry who still handled a bottle in his coat pocket the way you'd carry a rabbit's foot. Gil talked constantly. He talked to the dogs, he talked to the stove, he talked to a caribou skull we passed on the second day. If Gil went silent for more than a minute, you started worrying about him. Silas Doon was a trapper out of the Rennet Hills, brought on for his knowledge of the country east of the pass. He was maybe 40 and looked 70, and did not like a single one of us. He had a way of reading ground that I envied and resented. He also drank his coffee with salt in it, which none of us ever got an explanation for. Tobin Sorrow was 24 and had lied on his application. He'd been hired as a second packer, and it was obvious inside 2 hours that he had never spent a winter out. He was funny about it, at least. He asked good questions. He fell in love with the dogs immediately, which put him in my good books and in Booker's bad ones, because Booker didn't like anybody feeding his animals extra. And there was a man everybody called Cass, whose full name on the manifest was Wade Caswell. He was a Cordwain man, though we didn't know that word yet. He was the one who gave us the shots. That's a small thing that turned out to be the largest thing in my life, so I'll take a minute on it. On the second night at the staging cabin, Caswell set up a folding table and laid out a cardboard tray of glass ampoules with no labels on them, just a strip of white tape and a number written in pen. He said it was a cold weather prophylactic, a modified rabies-adjacent thing, standard for wildlife contact work. He said we'd each get one in the shoulder and one more in about a month if the operation ran long. Gil, who was the actual medic, picked up an ampoule and turned it in the lamplight for a while. "Where's the manufacturer's stamp?" he said. "Not really a question." "Field batch," said Caswell. "Field batch," Gil repeated and looked at me and shrugged with his whole body and rolled up his sleeve first to make it easier on everybody. That was Gil. He always went first when going first cost him something. Odette Lorne did not take hers. She said she had an allergy. She let Caswell wipe her arm and press the needle against the skin, and then she flinched at the last second, apologized, and made a great fuss about how she'd take it in the morning. She never did. I watched her do that and thought she was squeamish. Mine went in my left shoulder and burned like a wasp for about an hour, and by morning there was a hard little knot under the skin the size of a pea. Booker had one too. So did Tobin, so did Nadine, so did Silas, who complained about it for 2 days. I want to be clear that at the time it was the least interesting thing that happened that week. We took 2 teams up the river on the 21st. 9 dogs, which is more than we needed for the load, but fewer than I wanted for the country. Bishop ran lead. Cinder ran swing with a hard little cream-colored bitch named Halfpenny, who we called Penny, and who could pull twice her weight and would bite you if you got in front of her food. Behind them, Moth, who was afraid of the dark in a way we all made jokes about. Tuck, the big goofy one, all shoulders and no sense. Grebe, quiet and fast. Salt and Nan, littermates who ran like one animal. And Ivan, the youngest, who screamed like a person when he was excited. 9 dogs. I'm going to keep count for you as we go. It matters later. We made 22 miles the first day on a good crust with a low sun that quit on us at 4 in the afternoon, and we camped at the mouth of Skirmish Creek, and Tobin asked me why the dogs kept looking upriver. I told him dogs always look upriver. That was the second lie. The truth is that the dogs had been wrong since we left the gravel bar at Kelvit. A team that's happy makes noise. They argue, they tangle, they yell at each other. Somebody tries to bite somebody else's harness. Ours ran silent. Bishop kept his head level and his ears back and drove them like he was late for something. When we stopped, they didn't roll. They stood in their traces facing north and waited to be told what to do next. Booker noticed it before I did and said nothing for a day and a half, which is how Booker was. On the second night, he came over to my fire with a tin cup and sat on his heels and said, "You ever run a team through a burn?" I said I had. You know how they get. Nose up. Nothing in the air where there ought to be something. He blew on the coffee. It's like that, only there's no burn. There was no burn. There was also no marten sign, no fox, no ptarmigan busting out of the willows the way they should have been at that time of year. The first fresh track of any kind we cut was on the third day. Moose, a cow and a calf, moving fast on a straight line, which cows with calves do not do. They had gone through alders instead of around them. The calf had been bleeding from the flank for at least a mile before the tracks ended at the river ice. Not stopped. Ended. Silas Dune squatted over the last print for a long time with his mitten off, touching the edge of it. "Where'd they go?" said Tobin. "They didn't," said Silas. "Things don't just. I know what things do." Silas stood up and looked at the far bank, 300 yards of open ice away, and then he did something that stayed with me. He walked back to the sled and got his rifle out of the scabbard and carried it in his hands the rest of that day. And Silas Dune was a man who thought carrying a rifle in your hands instead of on your back was showing off. We found the caribou on the 25th. Hollow Pass runs up between two shoulders of rock and comes out on a bench above a long drop the locals call the Step, maybe 200 feet of broken shale down to a creek bottom that stays open all winter because of the current. It is not a place caribou go. There's no feed and no reason. We smelled it from a half-mile off, and that should have been impossible in that cold, and Gil said, "Well, something's dead," in the voice of a man hoping to be right. There were 160 animals in the creek bottom. I counted them later off Nadine's photographs because I did not have it in me to count them standing there. They were stacked 3 and 4 deep against the ice, every one of them broken, some of them still steaming faintly where the pile held heat. Cows, calves, 2 big bulls in velvet shed antlers. The creek had backed up behind the bodies and frozen into a shelf, so that a third of the herd was set into clear ice like something in a display case. And nothing had eaten them. That is the part one want you to hold on to. 160 caribou is more meat than every predator in that drainage could eat in a year. There was not a wolf track, not a raven, not a fox trail into that bottom. 40 feet of free protein sitting in a natural freezer, and the country had turned its back on it. Nadine got down on one knee at the lip of the step and put her binoculars on the far shoulder of the pass, and she stayed there long enough that Quaid asked her what she had. "Sign of the drive," she said. "Up on the bench." They came down the west side in a line, and something walked them off. "Walk them," said Quaid. "There's no run out. No scatter." She lowered the glasses. "You spook a herd, it fans." This herd stayed together for the last half mile and got tighter, not looser. Something was on both flanks and behind. Silas said, "Wolves do that." "Wolves eat," Nadine said. "I went up on the bench myself because I didn't believe any of it, and I found the tracks in the wind crust where the snow had set up hard. There were 2 lines of them, one on each side of where the herd had run, spaced about 15 feet apart, running parallel for as far as I followed them. The prints were long, longer than a man's, narrower, and they went down into the crust only about an inch, which meant whatever made them weighed almost nothing or knew how to move like it did. Between the 2 lines, at intervals, there were places where something had stopped and turned to face the herd. You could see the pivot. You could see where it had waited. That's a flanker holding a line. That's herding. I have driven cattle. I have run dogs. I know what a coordinated push looks like on the ground, and I stood up there in the last hour of daylight and understood that 160 animals had been marched off a cliff by something that had planned it and had then gone home without eating. When I came back down, Odette Lorne was on her knees at the edge of the pile with a scalpel and a stack of sample bags, working fast, and she was not taking wolf samples. She was taking bite margins. She was measuring the spread of the tooth marks on a bull's shoulder, where something had opened it and closed it again, the way you might check the weight of a sack of flour and put it back on the shelf. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "My job." Her hands were shaking, and it wasn't the cold, and both of us knew it. That night we camped on the bench, and the knocking started. It came from the timber on the west slope, maybe 600 yards out. One hard crack, like a bat on a fence post. Then a pause. Then 2 together. Then a long pause and 3. Tobin sat up in his bag and said, "Woodpecker," in a hopeful voice, at 9 o'clock at night in October at 30 below. The answer came from behind us. Not the same tree. Not the same slope. East side, about the same distance, in the same rhythm, a beat late, the way a man repeats back a number to make sure he wrote it down right. Then a third one further out, up the pass. Nobody slept. The dogs didn't bark. That was the thing that got into me. 9 dogs on a picket line, and not one of them made a sound. They lay flat with their chins on their paws and their eyes open, and when I walked the line at 2 in the morning, Bishop pressed his head against my leg and would not take it away. In the morning Grebe was gone. His chain was still clipped to the gang line and still clipped to his collar, and his collar was still buckled. It lay in the snow in a neat little pile, the way a collar lies when a dog has been lifted straight up out of it by something patient enough to work a buckle. There were no tracks within 30 feet of the picket line. Not one. There were tracks beyond that in a broad arc, coming in from the timber and going back out, and in the middle of that arc a clean circle of undisturbed snow with our dogs sitting in it, which is not possible, unless something crossed 40 feet of open ground without touching it. Booker walked that circle 3 times. Then he went and sat on the sled with his back to us for about 10 minutes. Tobin was crying and trying not to. Gil put a hand on the back of his neck and left it there and didn't say anything, which was the only time all season I saw Gil handle a thing without words. Quaid took photographs. He wrote in his notebook. I asked him straight out, in front of everybody, what we were actually hunting. He closed the notebook and he looked at me for a while, and he said, something that got out of a program. That was the first true thing he ever told me, and it took him 9 days. We had it out that morning, all of us, standing in a rough circle around the stove while it snowed the fine dry stuff that means it's getting colder. Quaid gave us maybe a tenth of it. He said there had been a research facility in the drainage. He said an animal had been kept there, and the animal was out, and the animal had gotten into the wild population and had changed the behavior of it. He said the operation was authorized to terminate the animal and any of the local population showing altered behavior. He used the phrase altered behavior 4 times and would not define it. Silas asked what kind of animal. Quaid said a predator. Odette Lorne stood there with her cigarette down to the paper and did not say one word, and I watched her not say it, and I thought, she knows every bit of this and more. Nadine, who had been quiet the whole time, said, how big? Quaid said, big. That's not an answer. It's the one I've got, Quaid said, and there was something in his voice then that I have thought about more than almost anything else in this story. It wasn't fear. It was embarrassment. He was ashamed. A man that hard doesn't get embarrassed unless he's already decided he's going to do something he'll have to live with. We voted to go on. I want that on the record too. I voted to go on. $11,000, a bad roof, and 8 dogs left on the line. 8 dogs. Bishop, Cinder, Penny, Moth, Tuck, Salt, Nan, Ivan. We crossed the pass on the 28th and dropped into the upper Chilliwack Basin, and that was where the country stopped being country and started being somebody's house. The first thing was the fence. It ran along the timberline on the north side of the basin for what we eventually measured at 2¼ miles. It was made of leg bones, moose, caribou, some bear, driven butt first into the frozen ground about 2 feet apart, all of them the same height, all of them leaning about 10 degrees to the east. Between them, strung at waist level, was a line of sinew with things tied into it. Hooves, jawbones, a dog's collar that was not ours, strips of hide, every 11 or 12 feet, a skull. Wind came through that fence all day and all night, and made a sound I can still produce in my mouth if somebody asks me to, which nobody ever should. Silas walked it for an hour and came back and said, it's a property line. Gil said, it's a scarecrow. It's both, said Odette, and everybody turned and looked at her, and she caught herself and shut up. Beyond the fence, the basin was organized. That's the only word. There were trails packed hard as pavement running between stands of timber, and they were not game trails, because game trails wander toward feed and water, and these ran straight and joined at right angles. There were places where the trails were roofed over with deadfall, so that you could move a 1/4 mile through open country without being seen from the air. There were caches, pits dug into the permafrost and lined with green spruce boughs, packed with meat that had been butchered, not torn. Cut lines on the bone. Not knife cuts. Something's fingernails, dragged the same way every time, by something that had learned where a joint comes apart. And there was the tree. We found it on the 1st of November, up a side draw about a mile from where we'd camped. A big white spruce with the lower limbs cleared off, and hanging from the upper limbs by their hind legs were 9 wolves. They had been hung with sinew, and the sinew had been tied. Not wrapped. Tied. A doubled loop and a locking turn. The same knot on every animal, the kind of knot you have to be taught or invent, and once you invent it you keep using it because it works. They hadn't been eaten either. Their bellies were open, and their insides were gone, and their hides were intact, and their eyes were still in their heads, frozen white. Below them the snow was clean. Whatever had done it had brought them their dead from somewhere else, hung them, hollowed them, and left. Nadine took the photographs. Quaid wrote. Gil talked, low and steady, mostly nonsense, the way a man does to keep himself in his own body. Tobin asked why. Nobody answered him, so I did, and I wish I'd kept my mouth shut, because I was right and it made things worse. I said, it's a message to the wolves. The wolves were gone out of that whole drainage. Every wolf in the upper Chilliwack had either been killed or had left. The bears were gone too, no dens, no fall diggings, nothing. Something had cleared the competition off the land, and then it had put 9 of them up in a tree at the mouth of a draw, where any other wolf coming in from the east would see it first thing. We were standing in a country that had been conquered. That night I sat up with the stove and did arithmetic. If it takes a pack of 8 wolves 4 days to bring down and eat a moose, and something has killed 160 caribou in one push and not eaten any of it, then it isn't hunting. Hunting has a purpose you can understand. This had a purpose I couldn't. Odette came and sat across from me around 2 in the morning and rolled a cigarette she didn't light. You want to ask me something, she said. I've got about 40. Ask the one you're actually going to lose sleep over. I said, how long has it been out? She was quiet a long time. Then she said, 6 years. 6 years. 6 winters of this, in a country the size of Connecticut with maybe 40 people living in it, and nobody had seen anything but a lot of dead moose and a bad run on the fur. How many of them are there? I said. She lit the cigarette then, and her hands were steady for the first time since Hollow Pass. That's the wrong question, she said. The right question is how many of them there were before. The attack came 4 nights later, and it did not come the way any of us had braced for. It came as a voice. We were camped in the lee of a rock rib above the Chilliwack, 2 tents and a tarp lean-to, the dogs on a line downwind. Around 11, Tobin unzipped his tent and got out and started walking. Gil heard the zipper and asked him where he was going, and Tobin said, Eli's calling me. I was in my bag 6 feet away with my boots off. Gil said my name out loud, and I said, I'm here, and Tobin stopped and turned around, and I have never seen a look like the one he had. He said, You're not out there? And from about 40 yards down the slope, in the dark, in my voice, something said, Tobin, come here. I need a hand with the dogs. It was my voice. Not close to my voice. Mine. The little rasp I've had since I got smoke in my lungs in '98. The way I run my words together when I'm tired. It said Tobin's name the way I said it, which was with the first syllable short, and it said it warmly. That was the flaw, and it took me another month to understand it. The warmth was wrong. I liked Tobin fine, but I had never once spoken to him with that much affection. It had my voice, and it did not have my proportion. Nadine put a light on the slope. There was nothing on the slope. The voice said, Eli, don't shine that at me, and it laughed. Silas put 4 rounds into the dark. When we swept it in the morning, we found a place where the snow had been pressed down in a shape about the size of a man kneeling, and a set of tracks leaving it, and here is the detail that mattered more than anything else we learned that winter. The tracks were bare human feet, 5 toes, high arch, and every single one of them was deeper at the toe than at the heel. A man walking puts his weight down through the heel first. Always. You can't fake it for 100 yards. Whatever it was, it had feet like a person, and did not know how a person's weight moves. We started sleeping in shifts after that, 2 on watch, and the 2 on watch had to keep talking to each other, and the talking is what broke us as much as anything, because there is nothing in this world that will hollow you out faster than sitting in the dark at 4 in the morning listening to somebody prove they're still themselves. The radio started on the 7th of November. We had 2 handhelds and a base set with a wire antenna we strung between trees at every camp. On the 7th, at about 6 in the evening, The bay set opened up and Rudy Voss's voice came through, clear as a bell, from a plane we could not hear, saying that he was inbound with a resupply and would be on the gravel bar in 20 minutes and asking us to light a fire. Quaid answered. Voss answered back and used Quaid's first name. We lit the fire. Nothing came. At 6:40, the set opened again and Voss said, I'm on the bar. Where are you? And there was engine noise behind him, the exact sound of a beaver idling, and there was no aircraft within 50 miles of us, and the gravel bar was 200 yards away and empty, and we were all standing there looking at it. Gil turned the volume all the way down, and then all the way off, and stood with his hand on the knob. That's a recording, Nadine said. It used my name, said Quaid. Then it's a good recording. Odette said very quietly, It isn't a recording, and walked away from the fire. Tobin died on the 9th. I have started this part 4 times, and I will do it plain. We were moving a cache up a frozen creek in low light. 3 of us, me and Tobin and Salt and Nan on a light sled. The creek had overflow ice on it, that gray shelf ice that builds in layers where water comes up through cracks, and I had told him twice that day to walk where I walked. We came around a bend, and there was a man kneeling on the ice about 80 yards up, in our clothes, hunched over, holding his leg, and he called out to us. He called out in Gil Prados' voice. He said, Eli, I went through, my leg's bad, I can't get up. I stopped the sled. I did not go forward. I had learned that much. I called back and asked him something only Gil would know. I asked him what he had in his coat pocket. There was a pause, and then the man on the ice said, a rabbit's foot. I had never said that out loud to anybody. That was a thing I thought. That was in my head, and it came back to me across 80 yards of ice in my friend's voice, and my legs went out from under me like somebody had cut them. Tobin ran. He was 24. Somebody was hurt on the ice. He ran, and I screamed at him, and Salt and Nan screamed too, and he got about 50 yards before the thing kneeling on the ice stood up. It kept standing. It was Gil's shape for the first foot and a half, and then it wasn't. It came up, and its arms hung too far, and its head sat forward off the neck, and it turned Gil's face toward Tobin, and Gil's face was on the front of it like a mask that had been pulled down wrong, one eye where it should be, and the other in the wrong place entirely, and it opened Gil's mouth wide enough to split the corners. Tobin stopped and turned back toward me. The ice took him first. He had run out onto the overflow shelf where it was 2 layers over open water, and the whole plate tipped and dropped him in up to the chest, and he screamed my name, and the thing came across that ice on all 4s faster than the dogs could have and put a hand on top of his head and pushed him under, and then it lay down on the ice with its arms in the water up to the shoulders, and it held him there. It took about 90 seconds. I could see him under the clear ice, moving, and then not. I emptied a rifle at it and hit it at least twice. It flinched the way you flinch at a bee. Then it got up and walked back the way it had come with its arms hanging, and left him in the water. When I went out there with a rope, the hole had already skinned over. We chopped for an hour. The current had taken him. We did not find Tobin Serro's body that winter. We found it in April, and I will tell you about that when I get there, because it was one of only 2 times in my life I have been unable to stand up on my own. After the creek, Quaid changed the operation. We stopped moving as one group. He split us into pairs, and we worked outward from a hard camp we built into the bank of the Chilliwack, a snow-roofed pit with 2 entrances and a stovepipe run through a hollow log, so the smoke came out cold and low. He also started the tests. It was Nadine's idea, and it was a good one, and I still don't know how she thought of it that fast. On the 10th of November, she took her knife and cut her own palm in front of everybody and held it up. Blood at 35 below steams. It comes out of you at 98 degrees into air that will freeze whiskey, and it puts up a thread of vapor you can see from 10 feet away in a headlamp. She said, anybody who won't do this, we tie up. So we cut ourselves. Every morning and every night, whoever came in from outside cut a palm at the door of the snow camp and held it in the light, and we watched for the steam. Gil did the wrapping. He said it was the stupidest medicine he'd ever practiced, and he never once argued against it. I have scars all down the heels of both hands from that November. I still cut myself sometimes without deciding to. That's a different problem. Wade Caswell died on the 14th. There's an old haul road that comes up out of the Rennet Hills to the Dunlap mine, cut in the 30s for a gold operation that went broke twice and burned once. 6 miles of grade with alders through it now, and at the top a collapsed camp, a bunkhouse folded like a card table, a rusted steam donkey the size of a truck with 200 feet of cable still spooled on the drum. Caswell and Nadine went up to check the adits. Booker and I ran the dogs behind them with the packs, Salt and Nan in wheel, Bishop leading, 4 of us on the road, 10:45 in the morning with maybe 3 hours of light left in the day. Caswell was 40 feet ahead when the cable came off the ground. They had run it across the road at ankle height under an inch of snow and taken the free end up over a limb and back down to a windfall spruce, deadweight, held by nothing but a stick and somebody's patience. When his boot took the cable, the stick went, the spruce dropped, and the loop that was lying loose around his legs snapped closed and took him up into the tree at about the speed of a hooked fish. It caught him around the left thigh. It did not cut him in half. That's important, because I think they meant it not to. He hung upside down about 18 feet up with his leg breaking slowly under his own weight, and he screamed for 4 hours. We couldn't get to him. That's the part. Nadine started up the trunk, and something threw a rock the size of a dinner plate out of the timber and broke 2 of her fingers. And when I moved to the base of the tree, 3 more came in, and 1 took Salt in the ribs and killed her where she stood in the traces. 7 dogs. They were up on the slope in the alders, and we could not see them, and every time one of us moved into the open under that tree, a rock came. Not a rush, not an attack. Rocks, thrown flat and hard from 150 feet by something that could count and could wait. They wanted us to sit under him. Caswell begged for a long time. First for help, then for a rope, then for his mother, and finally, when the light went, he begged Nadine to do it, by name, over and over. She did it at 4:20 in the afternoon from 110 yards with a headlamp on his chest, and she was crying while she did it, and afterward she cleaned the rifle before she took her mitts off, and her hand with the 2 broken fingers had swollen up over the trigger guard. Nobody said anything to her about it that night, which I have always regretted. There is a kind of silence people offer as respect that lands as abandonment. We got Caswell's body down the next morning with a climbing rig. His coat pockets had a laminated card in them with a phone number and the words Cordwain Applied Ecology, and under that, a line of type that read, "In the event of exposure, do not transport." Quaid took the card off him and put it in his notebook and told us it meant nothing. Odette looked at me and shook her head one time, small. Silas Doon went out on the 18th to check a line he'd set below camp and did not come back. There was no noise. There was no track past the second bend of the creek. He was there, and then he was subtracted, and we searched for 2 days, and on the second day we found his rifle standing upright in the snow for miles from camp, but stock down, barrel up, driven in about a foot, deliberately placed, and around it, in a ring, 11 bones from a caribou's leg pushed into the drift at the same angle as the fence. They had made a little copy of their fence around his rifle. Gil said, "Is that a grave?" Nadine said, "It's a receipt." We found Silas in February, and it is the corpse I would take out of my head first if I could choose. He was in the ice of a lake we called the Tin Pan, 6 miles east of anywhere he had reason to be. He was standing upright, under about 14 inches of clear ice, with his boots on the bottom in 8 feet of water, and his arms straight down at his sides and his chin up, and his eyes were open, and he was looking at the sky through the ice. They had put him there. He hadn't fallen in. You do not fall into a lake and end up standing on the bottom facing straight up with your hat still on your head. They had opened the ice, weighted him, set him, and let the lake close over him, and the whole thing had frozen into a window. His boots were on the wrong feet. That last detail is the one that told us what had been walking around wearing his shape for the 4 days after he vanished, calling to us from the willows in his voice, saying it had gotten turned around, and could somebody come out to the creek. Gil Prater died on the 24th of November, and I want to tell it carefully, because his was the death the thing worked hardest on. Gil had a son named Aaron who died at 19 in a car on a road outside Palmer, and Gil had been drunk in a chair at home when it happened, and he had told exactly one person on that trip about it, and that person was me, in the dark on watch on the 4th of November, because that is what the watches did to us. I have carried that ever since. On the 23rd, at about 2 in the morning, A young man's voice started calling from outside the snow camp. It called for his dad. It was polite about it. It said, "Dad, it's cold. Dad, I can't find the door." Gil sat with his back against the wall and his hands over his ears, and Nadine held him, and I sat in the entrance with a rifle across my knees, and it went on until first light. For hours. It never got angry, and it never got louder. When it wanted a rest, it would go quiet, and we would start to breathe, and then it would say, very close to the snow wall, "Dad, don't be like this." The next night it did the same thing. Only that night it started telling him things. Small things. What was in the boy's pockets? What the trooper had said at the door. The exact words Gil had said back to the trooper, which Gil later swore to me he had never repeated to a living soul. I think that thing had been near enough to our sleeping heads to learn us. I think it stood outside our tents at night and listened to us breathe, and I think whatever it takes off us, it takes it through the breath, because it never learned anything about a man that the man had not thought about in the dark. At about 4 in the morning of the 24th, Gil went out. We were both on watch, and I fell asleep. Sitting up. 11 days of 2-hour sleeps, and I went out like a light for maybe 6 minutes, and when I woke, the entrance flap was open, and the cold was coming in, and his boots were gone. I have gone over those 6 minutes more than I have gone over any other part of my life. We tracked him 1.25 miles. He had gone in a straight line, which a lost man never does. We found him kneeling in a clearing, facing east, frozen solid in that position with his coat off and folded beside him, which is a thing hypothermia makes men do, and both of his hands were up against the sides of his head. He had taken his gloves off and pushed his thumbs into his own ears until he ruptured both eardrums. He did it so he could stop hearing it. The thing was still there when we found him. Not visible, but when Nadine put a light around the clearing, something in the timber said, in Gil's warm and talkative voice, "Well, don't just stand there, boys." Nadine shot at it and hit a tree, and the tree said, "Ow," and laughed and moved off. Odette Lorne came and stood next to me while we were chipping at the ground with an axe to make a place to put him, and she said, without any preamble at all, "They called it Wren." I said, "What?" "On the paperwork. When they contracted it." She was looking at Gil's body. "It isn't with the others because it wants to be. It was hired." I said, "Hired by who?" And she said, "Get me to the substation and I'll show you." There were 5 of us left. Me, Quaid, Nadine, Odette, and Booker Tallis, who by then had stopped talking almost entirely and slept out with the dogs every night with his hand through the gang line, so nothing could lift one without waking him. 7 dogs on the 24th of November, Bishop, Cinder, Penny, Moth, Tuck, Nan, and Ivan. Nan was ruined by then. She'd been on the road when Salt died and something in her had broken, and she would not go into standing timber. She'd lie down at the edge of it and shake and piss herself and let you drag her, and after 2 days of that, Booker rode her on the sled like a passenger and told her she was retired. On the 26th, Penny went. She was on the line inside the camp entrance, and in the morning she was gone with the snaps still clipped. 6 dogs. That night, from out past the fence, we heard her bark. Just once. 6 miles away, in country you could not cross in the dark. Booker stood up and Nadine put a hand flat on his chest and said, "It's the other thing. It does dogs too." She was wrong, but it took me until February to know that. Cinder was taken on the 29th, out of the middle of the team, in daylight, from a trail we had run twice before. We were coming down off a bench in flat gray light with the sled loaded and the dogs trotting, and there was a sound like a rope going through a pulley, and Cinder was simply not in her harness anymore. The harness was still buckled. Booker stopped the team in 4 seconds, and I had my rifle up in 3, and there was nothing on that slope but our own tracks and a spray of snow off a limb 60 feet up the hill. They could take a dog out of a moving team. We went after her, which was stupid, and we lost the rest of the daylight doing it, and when we came back to the sled, Moth had chewed through her tug line and was gone into the willows, and we spent the night calling for 2 dogs and got nothing back. Moth came in at dawn on her own, wet to the shoulder and shaking. 4 dogs on the line and 1 riding. We found Cinder on the 1st of December. It was Booker who saw her. There is a stand of big spruce below the fence line on the north side, old trees, and about 35 feet up in one of them, tied in with sinew across the chest and under the front legs so that she was sitting upright on a limb like a person in a chair, was my dog. She was alive. She had been up there at least 2 days. Her hind legs were frozen. She saw us and she started up, that high rising sound a dog makes when it's been left somewhere, and she tried to come to us, and the sinew held her, and she hung and scrabbled and got herself back onto the limb. Booker went for the tree. I put my arm across him and he hit me in the mouth, and I stayed on him, and I said the thing I have hated myself for ever since. I said, "Look at the snow," because I had already looked at the snow. There was a ring around that tree at about 80 feet out, and inside the ring it was clean, and outside it there were prints, and the prints were pressed down and refilled and pressed down again, which happens when something stands in one place for a long time and shifts its weight. 6 positions, all of them with a clear lane to the base of that tree. They had not put her up there because they were cruel. They had put her up there because they had learned that a barking dog brings men, and men climb, and a man on a rope 40 feet up a spruce with his rifle slung is the easiest thing in the world to take. She was bait, and she was going to keep being bait as long as she was making noise, and there was no way on God's earth to get her down. I had 11 rounds for the rifle. I sat down in the snow with my back against a deadfall, so I could get steady, and I called her name once so she would look at me, and I did it at 40 yards. Booker Tallis did not speak to me again for 8 days, and then he spoke to me twice, and then he died. That is the whole of it. I don't have anything to put around it that makes it better. We reached the substation on the 4th of December. Odette had been navigating off a set of coordinates she'd had in her head the entire time, which she admitted the night after Gil died, along with the rest of it, in a flat voice, in front of everyone, while Quaid sat with his rifle across his knees and let her. She was Cordwain. She had worked on the program from the beginning, left during its 2nd year, and spent the years since trying to get somebody to look at what was happening in the Upper Chilliwack. The only way she had found to get back into that country legally was to sign on to the operation that had been organized to make sure nobody ever looked. Substation 4 was under a fold of ground 3 miles off the river, and it did not look like anything. A pair of vent stacks, a steel door in a berm, snowed over, and a prefab building crushed flat under 20 years of drift with a Bear Research placard still bolted to the frame. The door was open. Something had opened it from the outside, a long time ago, by pulling the hinge pins. Inside it was warmer than out, and it smelled like burnt insulation and old iron, and, underneath that, like a kennel. I'm going to tell you what was in there without dressing it up. There was a corridor with a floor drain running down the middle of it, and the drain had been used. There were 6 holding cells with 3-inch bar spacing that had been bent outward, not inward, in 5 of them. There was a room with a wall of stainless drawers where they had kept samples, and every drawer was open and empty, and the racks were bent. There was an office with a filing cabinet that had been burned in place with an accelerant, so thoroughly and so professionally that Odette said one word, sanitized, and moved on without looking twice. And there was a room at the end that they had built for one animal. The bars in that one were 4 inches of solid stock, and they were not bent. They had been cut. There was a torch scar on the floor, and a cutting rig still sitting in the corner with the tanks empty. Somebody let it out with a torch, and then walked out ahead of it. The paper survived in the wrong places, the way it always does. There was a filing box under a collapsed shelf that the fire had missed, and there were 3 field recorders in a drawer, and a folder in a desk with a coffee cup rusted onto it. Here's what we put together, that night and later. Cordwain Applied Ecology held a research contract for what the paperwork called Anomalous Macrofauna Population Assessment. In plain words, they knew what was in this country. They had known for a long time. Not because of legends. Because in 1987 a survey crew brought back a body, and it was not a bear, and it did not decay in a way that made sense. And somebody in an office decided that if a thing like that existed, then somebody else was going to weaponize it eventually, and it may as well be us. They could not fight the population. It's too dispersed, too cold, too big a country, and every attempt to control it directly cost people. So they decided to fight it with itself. They took a live one in the winter of 2009, out of a den complex at the head of the Sarazan Glacier, using a bait line and 11 men, and they lost 4 of the 11 and got it into a truck. The program was called Pale Shepherd. The idea was simple, and it was clean, and it was the worst thing I have ever heard of. The population had a hierarchy. There was one old animal at the top of it, enormous, ancient, and the whole system deferred to it, the way it moved, where it fed, when it bred. Cordwain called that animal the apex persistent. The people who had lived in that country for 10,000 years had a different name, which one of Odette's colleagues had recorded in a footnote and translated as the Long Father. Cordwain's plan was not to kill the population. Their plan was to take a young one, improve it, and give it the throne. They modified it over 4 years. I am not a scientist, and Odette's explanation took an hour, but the parts that stayed with me were these. They raised its metabolic ceiling enormously, so it could outgrow anything it fought. They did something to the brain to lengthen its planning horizon. She used the phrase, "We taught it to want things it couldn't have yet." And then she put her face in her hands. They conditioned it with sound. There was a two-tone signal, about 1.5 seconds long, that they used with pain from the first month of its life, and by the end that tone would put the animal flat on the floor of its cell every time. That was the leash. It was the only leash they had. And they built one more thing into it, because you cannot raise the furnace in an animal that size without a way to dump the heat. The modified metabolism ran hot, 14 degrees above what the rest of its kind ran. Odette said it flatly, like it was nothing, and it turned out to be everything. It had to shed that heat regularly, or it would cook itself from the inside. In the lab they gave it a chilled floor. In the wild it would need ice, running water, deep snow, cold rock. The colder the country, the stronger it was. The colder the country, the stronger it was. Think about that in relation to a creature that spent 6 years emptying every valley it could reach of every warm-blooded animal that ate meat. They released it in April of 2013 with a tracking implant and an observer team, and by June it had killed the Long Father in the ice caves at the head of the Sarazan, and by September it had stopped answering the tone, and by the following spring the observer team was 4 missing persons files and a burned cabin. Cordwain wrote it off, sealed the site, and spent the next 5 years quietly buying up every report that came out of the Chilinak drainage. And they contracted the other thing. That was in the folder too. Asset Ren, retained for site security and personnel dissuasion, which is a way of saying that when hunters or trappers or a family on a snow machine got too close to the substation, something went out and talked to them until they were gone or dead. They paid it. I never learned what with, and Odette wouldn't say, and I have decided I don't want to know. There was one line in that file that I read 4 times and did not understand until the very end. Under handling notes, somebody had typed, "Asset requires a secure depository within operational range. Do not disturb retained material. Asset cannot reconstitute a persona without access." I asked Odette what a depository was. She said, "It keeps what it takes off people. It has to go back to it." She was already looking at something else. Don't get excited. Nobody's ever found one. At some point in those 6 years, the thing they had made and the thing they had hired stopped working for Cordwain and started working for each other. Quaid let her finish. Then he told his part, and to his credit he told it without excuses. Fallow Gate was not a control operation. Fallow Gate was an assessment. They needed to know how far it had spread, how organized it had become, and whether the population had held together under the new animal, and the cheapest instrument they had for finding that out was 8 people and a guide walking into the middle of it with a radio. We were the probe. Nadine asked him what the extraction plan had been. He said there wasn't one. She sat very still for a while, and then she said, "And the shots." Quaid said he didn't know what was in the shots. I believed him at the time. I have gone back and forth on it since. He had 2 more things to give us, and they mattered more than anything else in that room. The first was the tone. It was on one of the 3 field recorders, a stubby orange thing with a cracked case, and when Odette powered it up, 2 of the 3 were dead, and the third had a battery bar sitting at about 1/5. She played it once, into a coat, muffled, and even like that it made my teeth hurt. She said, "It won't work the way it did. It's had 6 years to unlearn it." I asked how long it would work. She said, "Seconds. Maybe. Once." The second thing Quaid gave us was the rest of his notebook, which he handed to me personally with his glove off, which is the closest thing to an apology a man like that has in him. He was killed about 90 minutes later, and I saw it, and it is the reason I did not sleep properly for 6 years. The dogs told us first. They were staked in the entrance corridor out of the wind, and all 5 of them stood up at once and faced the door, and none of them made a sound. Then Bishop turned his head and looked at the ceiling. There was a noise on the roof of that berm like somebody dragging a wet sack, and then the smell came down the vent stack, and it was not the smell I expected. It wasn't rot. It was hot metal. It was the smell of a wood stove with something spilled on it. Quaid went out the door first because that was the kind of man he was, and Nadine went after him, and I got as far as the frame. It was standing on the berm about 30 feet away, and the snow around its feet had gone to water. I need you to understand that I had built a picture in my head from 6 weeks of tracks, and I had built it wrong. I had been imagining something starved. Ribs and hunger. What was up on that berm was not starved. It was 9.5 feet of loaded muscle under gray skin that fit it badly, like wet paper laid over an engine, and it was steaming. Vapor came off its shoulders and its back, and went up in the still air in a column you could see against the sky, and where it stood the ground had melted down to gravel. Its arms came almost to the ground, and the joints in them ran the wrong way at the elbow, so that when it moved they folded like a bird's. Its head was long and narrow and set forward off the neck, and there was no fur on it, and there were no antlers on it, and I mention that because people always ask. What it had was a jawbone. Not its own. An enormous lower jaw, bigger than its own head, bone gone brown with age, wired around its throat with cable. Our cable, hardware store cable, so that it hung across the front of its chest like a collar. It had taken that off the Long Father in 2013, and it had worn it ever since. At the back of its neck, where the skull met the spine, there was a raised place under the skin about the size of a paperback book, and it was too straight to be natural, and the skin over it was shiny and puckered the way skin goes when it has been opened and closed by somebody in a hurry. It looked at Quaid. Then it spoke, and it spoke through the old jaw, which moved, which is a thing I have never been able to explain to anybody. The voice came out layered. There were 3 or 4 voices in it, and one of them was a woman's, and one of them sounded like a man reading numbers aloud. It said, "You are the last of the counting." Quaid shot it 4 times in the chest, and it took the rounds and did not fall down and did not charge. It reached out, almost lazily, and took hold of the vent stack, 6-inch steel pipe, set in concrete, 20 years in the permafrost, and pulled it out of the ground the way you'd pull a weed, and it turned and put the ragged end of that pipe through Merrick Quaid. Not through his body, through the ground beneath him. It drove it down through him and into the frozen gravel and left him there on it, upright, off his heels, with his arms still moving. Nadine emptied a magazine into its back from 11 yards. It turned around and looked at her, and steam came off it in the cold, and its skin ran with meltwater. And then it looked past her at me. I was in the doorway with a rifle I hadn't raised. It came down off the berm and crossed to the door and put its face down to my level, close enough that the heat off it dried the frost out of my beard, and it stopped. It breathed in. It stood there and it breathed me in twice slow, the way a horse checks a stranger. Then it made a sound in its chest that I have heard exactly one other time, and I will get to that, and it stepped back and turned and went up the slope, and where it walked the snow melted and refroze behind it into a ribbon of black glass. It did not kill me. It had a hand free, and it did not kill me. I told the others it had run out of interest. Nadine looked at me for 1 second too long and said nothing, and I saw the thought arrive behind her eyes, and that thought did more damage to what was left of us than the rest of that night. We ran. That's the honest word. Not withdrew. We put what we could carry on one sled. We took Quaid's notebook and Odette's folder and the recorder with 1/5 of a battery in it, and we went south down the Chilliwack at 4 in the morning with 4 dogs pulling and 1 riding, and the whole basin came with us. They did not attack in a mass. They herded us. For 3 days we could not go east. Every time we tried an eastern line there would be sign across it, fresh, deliberately fresh, a gut pile still steaming, a fence section built in an hour, and once, on the 11th, a row of 11 marten laid out nose to tail across a slough for 200 yards, none of them eaten. South and west were open, and we took south and west because we had no choice, and it took me 2 days to understand that we were being driven exactly the way that caribou herd had been driven, and that somewhere ahead of us was our step. Nadine Vogt died on the 7th of December on a rock rib above the river. She had gone up to give us overwatch while we brought the sled through a bad side hill, and she was in a good position, a real one, with rock at her back and 200 yards of open below her, and something on the top of that rib rolled a frozen bull moose off the crest. 800 pounds of animal, frozen solid, coming down 80 feet of rock. She heard it. She had time to look up. There was nothing to do with the time. We didn't find her. There was no finding her. There was a place where the snow had gone dark and a rifle bent into a shape that a rifle doesn't go, and above us, on the crest, 3 shapes standing in a line, not moving. That was the first time I saw the different kinds. 2 of them were the tall, thin ones, the kind that had made those shallow tracks on the bench at Hollow Pass, light, long-limbed, running on all 4s over crust that wouldn't hold a fox. Scouts. They carried nothing and did nothing but watch and move. The 3rd one was different. It was shorter and enormously heavy across the shoulders, and its arms were like the branches of a cottonwood, and it had a rope of braided sinew over one shoulder with hooves and hardware knotted into it. It had rolled the moose. That was its job. They had a word for that kind, and I learned it much later from a mouth that could barely form our words, and the closest thing in English is haulers. The scouts watched. The hauler worked. Something else did the arranging, and something else again did the killing, and there was one more kind that I did not meet until February and wish I never had. Booker Tallis died on the 9th. We were 3 then, me, Booker, Odette, and we had 4 dogs pulling and Nan riding on the load, and Booker had been talking to me again for a day. He'd come up alongside me at a rest and said, "That tree." "Just that." I said, "I know." He said, "You did it right." And after about a minute he said, "I'd have got both of us killed." That was it. That was the whole reconciliation, and I have run it in my head 10,000 times, and I would not change a word of it. That night they came into the camp for the dogs. We were in a hasty snow pit with a tarp over it, and the team was picketed 6 feet from the entrance, and at some point after midnight Moth started screaming, and Booker went out through the flap before I had my boots on. They had the picket line. Not the dogs, the line itself. Something had a grip on the gang line and was walking backward with it, dragging 4 dogs and Nan and the sled anchor across the snow toward the timber, and Booker went into that on his feet with an axe. He got tuck loose. He cut Moth free, and Moth ran off into the dark, and I never saw her again. He was working on Bishop's snap when the thing that had the line let go of it and came down the line to him. It was one of the arrangers. That's my word. Its eyes had been sewn shut. Not damaged, not empty, stitched with sinew in a neat line, and it was old, and its skin hung on it in folds, and its hands were enormous, and its fingers were too many joints long. It moved by feel and by sound, and it did not need eyes at all. It came down that gangline hand over hand, feeling for him. Booker hit it 4 times with the axe. I heard every one. I was crawling out of a collapsed snow pit with a rifle full of packed snow, and I heard 4 axe blows, and then I heard the 5th one stop halfway. It took him at the shoulder and it walked off with him, and he was making no sound, and I put 3 rounds into the dark after it and hit timber. In the morning there were 11 feet of drag mark, and then nothing. They left the sled. They left the food. They left the fuel. They took a 62-year-old man and 1 crippled dog off the load, and left everything a starving animal would have taken, and I sat in the snow next to Bishop with my hands in his ruff and understood, finally and completely, that hunger had nothing to do with any of it. Odette Lorne was taken on the 12th of December at the Sarazen Crossing, and I was 200 yards away, and I watched it happen and could not close the distance in time. We had to cross the outwash below the glacier, a half-mile of open braided gravel with ice shelves over the channels. I went first with the team to break trail. She came behind with the pack. Halfway across, the ice she was on stood up. That's what it looked like. A section of gray shelf ice about 6 feet long rose, and it was not ice. It was one of them lying flat under a crust of snow, and it had been there long enough to be snowed over, which means it had been there since before we chose our line. They had known where we would cross. Of course they had. There is only one place to cross. She got one hand up. The folder fell from her grip and skidded across the ice toward me. I shot twice and hit it once, and it took her across the outwash at a run, and Tuck broke his tug, and went after them, and I never saw either of them again alive. I recovered the folder from the ice before I left the crossing. I stood in the middle of a half-mile of gravel with 2 dogs and 5 rounds, and a dead man's notebook, and I screamed at that glacier until my voice went, and nothing answered. Then, from somewhere up in the moraine, in Odette's voice, close and calm and perfectly ordinary, something said, "Eli, it's all right. I'm fine." She was not fine. I heard her voice for the next 9 weeks. It called to me from ridgelines and from under ice and once from inside a stovepipe. It got the tone wrong every time. It was always a little too calm. That is how I know Odette Lorne died screaming. I was the only human left from the 12th of December to the 2nd of January. There is not much to say about those 3 weeks that will hold your interest. I went south and then west, off the drainage entirely, over the low end of the Vashik through a pass that isn't a pass, mostly at night, because the scouts hunted by day in that country, and I had worked that much out. I ate what was on the sled, and then I ate the fuel-soaked crackers at the bottom of the food box, and then I set snares and got nothing, because there was nothing to catch. I lost the tips of 2 fingers on my left hand in the 3rd week. I have a photograph of the sled at the point where I abandoned it, and I look at that photograph sometimes to remind myself that the man in it was me. Bishop and Ivan stayed with me. 2 dogs. Bishop was 11 years old, and he walked in my tracks and slept against my back, and he was the reason I got up on at least 4 mornings when I had already decided not to. On the 2nd of January, I crossed into country I had never worked, west of the Rennet Hills, up a drainage with no name on any map I've seen. There were tracks in there. Wolf tracks, big and fresh, and I stood over them and started laughing, because there had not been a wolf track east of the Vashik in 6 years, and here were 20 of them. I followed the tracks because I was starving and stupid, and I thought where there are wolves there is meat. They were not wolf tracks. I know the difference now. A wolf sets its hind foot in the print of its front. These did that for a while, and then, in the shelter of a cut bank where they'd stopped, there were prints where something had stood up and put its weight on 2 legs, and the hind foot spread out like a hand. Ivan died about 40 minutes later. I don't hold it against them, and I want to be clear about that. I came into their country at night, uphill, downwind, following their line with a rifle. 2 of them took Ivan out of the trail behind me so fast that his scream and the silence after it were almost the same sound, and when I turned around, the trail behind me had 5 of them in it. I did not shoot. That's the only thing I did right. I put the rifle down in the snow, and I sat down on it. They took me 9 miles that night, and part of that I don't remember. The ledger, that's as close as their word comes over into ours, lived in a complex of dug dens and rock overhangs under a limestone face, with 3 fires going and a lot of very quiet children who were made to go inside when I arrived. They are not what the movies made. They were not men in fur suits, and they were not wolves standing up. They were long in the hind leg and deep in the chest, and the biggest of them, standing, was a foot over my height with a reach that made my reach a joke. Their faces were mostly wolf, and their eyes were entirely not. Their hands had a thumb that worked. They wore things, belts, mostly, and slings, and a lot of them had woven cord around one wrist with knots in it, and I learned that the knots were names. Their old one spoke English. It came slow and low out of a throat that wasn't built for it, and it cost them something to do it, and they only did it when it mattered, which meant when one of them started to speak, everybody stopped. The matriarch was called Osra Fen. She was gray to the shoulders and had lost most of an ear, and one of her eyes was ruined white, and she was smaller than her sons, and every one of them stepped back when she came forward. She kept the actual ledger, which was a bundle of split willow sticks in a hide roll, each one notched, some of them older than the oldest living member. Debts owed, debts paid, names of the dead, and what killed them. They put me by a fire, and they discussed me for 6 hours in their own language while I sat there thawing and shaking. Then Osra came and crouched in front of me and said, "You are the guide from the river." That put a cold in me that had nothing to do with the weather. I asked her how she knew that. "You have been talked about," she said, "on the other side of the mountain for 2 months. There is a thing there wearing men's voices, and it is telling everything it learns to everything that listens." She tilted her head. "It says your name a great deal." Then she leaned in and she breathed me in, the same way the shepherd had, twice slow. and her lip went up off her teeth, and her whole body changed shape without moving, and behind me I heard 6 of them come up off the ground. She said, "You smell like the thing on the other side of the mountain." I said, "I've been 3 months in its country." She held there a long moment. Then she sat back on her heels and said, "Yes, that will be it." And the 6 behind me sat down. I have thought about that pause more or less every day since. I had 2 things to trade, and I spent them both that first night. The first was Quade's notebook and Odette's folder, and everything I knew about Cordwain, which mattered to them more than I expected, because the ledger had a debt on a stick from 2004. A young one of theirs had been trapped in a leg snare on the Rennet side, and had been taken away in a truck by men with a Bear Research placard on the door, and had never come back. Osra had walked 11 days to find that truck's tracks, and had lost them at a road. When I told her the name of the company, she got up and took a willow stick out of the roll and set it in the fire and watched it burn. Tovar, her eldest, asked her something in their tongue. She answered one word, and he went quiet. The second thing I spent was the wolves. I told them about the tree. 9 wolves, hind legs, sinew tied with a knot, hollowed out and left. I described the knot. I drew it in the ashes with a stick. Nobody moved for a while. They do not think they are wolves. I want to be accurate. They think of true wolves the way you might think about a cousin's family. Not you, but yours. And if somebody hangs 9 of them in a tree at the mouth of a draw as a notice, it is a notice to you. Tovar said in English slowly, "How far is this tree?" I said, 200 miles, and it isn't there anymore because I came back through and cut them down. Osra Fen looked at me for a long time. That night she took me into the back of the deep den where they keep their old, and she showed me one of them. He was enormous, and he was lying on his side, and his hind legs did not work anymore, and half his face was gone in a way that had healed 20 or 30 years earlier. His name was Kest. He did not speak at all, not their language and not ours, and one of his hands was permanently curled shut around nothing. Osra said, "This one has a debt at Vesper Draw. When you have finished asking us for help, I will tell you what it is, and then you will ask us for something much harder." They spent 11 days confirming what I told them, which is exactly what I would have done. They sent 4 runners east under Tovar. 3 came back. What they brought back was worse than anything I'd given them. The fence had moved. It was 30 miles further west than where I'd last seen it, and it was still going up, and behind it the country was already empty. They also brought back a piece of information that changed the war before it started, and they did not know what they had. Tovar said there was a place at the head of the Sarazin where the ice steamed. He said the shepherd went there. Not once. Regularly. He said his runner had watched from a ridge for 2 nights and had seen the big one come down out of the ice caves and go into a melt pool under the glacier and lie in it, all the way under, for a long time, with only the jawbone at its throat above the water, and come out and go back up, and that the Wendigos around it kept 100 yards off while it did. I sat by that fire with my hands wrapped in hide, and I thought about a chilled floor in a cell at Substation 4. It had to cool. Every animal on this earth that runs hot has to get rid of the heat. A dog pants. A caribou dumps it through the legs. And a thing built in a basement to have a furnace where its patients should be had to lie down in ice water on a schedule. And there was exactly one place in that whole country cold enough and wet enough to do it fast. If it had to cool, then it could be made too hot. And if it could be made too hot, then there was one piece of ground in 500 miles where I could take it. I knew about the Lantern Field because I had buried my brother in it. Eli Marston was 33 when his plane went into the ridge above it, in a whiteout, in October, 9 years before any of this, on a flight I had told him to make. Not asked. Told. I had a party of clients on a schedule and a weather window I chose to read optimistically, and I said, "You've flown worse." And he had, and this time he didn't come back out. I found the wreck 4 days later on the bench above the burn. There's a coal seam under that country that caught fire sometime before anybody was writing things down, and it is still burning, 100 feet under the ground, and it will burn for another 1,000 years. You come up over the ridge in December, and there is a piece of ground 2 miles long where the snow will not lie. Steam comes up through the moss. The willows there leaf out in February, and die in March, and leaf out again. In the middle of it the ground is warm enough that you can put your bare hand on it, and there are places where the crust over the burn is thin as a plate, and if you step wrong you go into a hole with nothing at the bottom of it but heat and gas. I could not get Anders' body off that ridge alone, and by the time I could have come back with help there was no point, and so I put him in the one piece of ground in that country that was soft in October, and I have never told anybody that until right now. I sat in a den full of werewolves in January, and I understood that I was going to have to go back there, and take the worst thing that has ever walked in Alaska with me, and stand on my brother's grave while it died. I told Osrafen the plan in its rough shape. She listened to the end. Then she said the thing I had been dreading since the day she showed me Kest. She said, "We cannot drive it that far. We are 91, and 40 of those are young or old. To move that animal 200 miles, we would need to be twice what we are." She turned the ledger roll over in her hands. "There is one people in this country who can hold a line in daylight and break a wall of them head on." I said, "Then let's talk to them." Tovar made a sound. Osra said, "We killed their children." Here is what happened at Vesper Draw in the winter of 1978, as Osrafen told it to me, sitting on a rock with her ledger sticks in her lap and no expression I could read. The draw is good winter ground, low and sheltered, with a creek that stays open. Both peoples wanted it. The ledger had held it for 2 generations, and the other side had come in during a bad year and dug in on the south face and would not leave. Osra's mother was matriarch then. She did not want to fight in the open, because in the open, against those particular neighbors, her people lose. So she sent one of hers down to a human trapline 40 miles away, and he brought back 4 tins of strychnine out of a trapper's cache. Kess set the bait, 11 pieces into 11 caches, in the ground the other side used to teach their young to dig. 13 died. 11 of them were children. Osra was 19 years old. She told me she had helped carry the tins. "We took it out of a human's cabin," she said, "and we used it the way a human uses it, and that is why they hate us both with the same tooth. If we had fought them, it would be finished. Everyone loses children in a fight. Nobody forgives poison." I asked her why she was telling me. She said, "Because you are going to stand in front of them and ask them to walk beside us, and if you do not know it, they will tell you, and then you will look surprised, and then they will kill you." We went to Vesper Draw in the 3rd week of January. Osra, Tovar, for others, and me, and old Kest carried on a litter of lashed poles by 2 of them, because Osra had made a decision on the walk and had not told me what it was. We stopped 2 days out, and Osra sent me on ahead alone. Human first. It had to be human first, or the first thing they smelled coming down that draw would be the ledger, and we would never get a word in. I camped that night by myself under a cut bank with Bishop, no fire, at about 40 below, and I slept the way you sleep when you have been running on nothing for 6 weeks, which is like a stone dropped in a well. In the morning there was a bell in Bishop's fur. Brass about the size of a thumbnail, the kind that goes on a cat's collar or a horse's rig, tied in behind his left ear with a strip of soft hide, in a knot I had never seen before or since. There was a track by the cut bank. 1. Everything else had been swept, and I mean swept. You could see the arcs where something had brushed the snow with a bundle of spruce, the way a man rakes a lawn. But it had left one. It was 16.5 inches long and 8 across the ball, and the toes were mobile, spread wide with the middle 2 set forward, and it was pressed down 11 inches into a crust that held me at 190 pounds. Bishop was standing next to me with his hackles flat and his tail up, wagging. He had not made a sound all night. I want to say one thing here that I have never been able to make anybody understand. That bell was the single most frightening thing that happened to me all winter in that country, and I include the vent pipe and the tree and the ice. Because everything else that took an interest in me wanted me dead and did not care whether I knew it. This one had stood over a sleeping man and a dog that would bite God, and had put its hands in that dog's fur, and had done fine work with a knot, and had gone away. It was telling me something, and I did not know what. I put the bell in my chest pocket and walked into Vesper Draw and shouted until they came. They came out of the ground. I had been told what to expect, and I still nearly ran. Where the ledger were long and fast and built for distance, these were built like the thing that lands on you. Shorter in the leg, enormously deep through the chest and shoulder, with a head that was mostly jaw and a jaw that could break a moose femur, which I later watched one do for no better reason than that it was thinking about something else. They stood squarer than the ledger. They fought standing. They took hold. 19 of them came up out of the south face and made a half circle around me and did not say anything, and then a big scarred one came through the middle and put his face about 4 inches from mine and breathed on me for maybe 15 seconds, and then said, in English better than Osra's, "You have moonliar on your coat." That was Ushin. He was the closest thing they had to a leader, which with them is not a title. It is just the individual everyone else has stopped arguing with. He had a gray muzzle and 2 of his lower teeth were gone, and there was a strip of old rope worn around his left wrist that I eventually learned had come off a child's toy. His sister was Vel, smaller, quicker, and the only one of them who never once looked at me directly the whole time I was there, which I came to understand was contempt. And there was Grast, who was the biggest living thing I have ever stood next to that was not a whale, and who had precisely one facial expression. I made my case standing in a half circle of them with my hands out of my pockets for 4 hours. I told them everything. The program, the substation, the jaw at its throat, the fence, the caribou, the wolves in the tree, my people one at a time. I told them the numbers Tovar's runners had brought back. I told them that in 6 years the thing had emptied every drainage east of the Vashik of bear and wolf and wolverine, and that it had not eaten one of them. Ushin listened to all of it and then said, "This is east. We are west." I said, "The fence moved 30 miles west in 9 weeks. He said, "Then it will take a long time to reach us." And I said the thing I had been holding, which was cruel, and which I had decided on the walk-in that I was going to use. I said, "It won't need to. You've already lost someone." He didn't move. I said, "You sent scouts east. Everyone sends scouts east. Osra Fen sent 4 and got 3 back. How many did you send, and how many came home? And did you tell your people what you thought had happened, or did you tell them a story about a bear?" Vel made a noise. Ushin said quietly, 3 seasons. 6 gone. I said, "I can take you to where they are." And that was true because I had seen it. On the way west in December, I had crossed a place below the fence where the ground had been cleared in a rough circle and posts driven, and there were things on those posts that were not wolves and not men and not moose, and I had not been able to make sense of the shapes at the time. I could make sense of them now. That was the moment the room turned, if you can call a snow-covered draw a room. Not because he believed me about the world ending, because I had found his dead. Then Osra Fen came down the draw with 5 of the ledger behind her, and the whole thing nearly ended in about 4 seconds. I have never in my life heard a sound like the 119 of them made at once. Grast went past me at a dead run, and Tovar met him, and the 2 of them went into the creek ice and through it, and for about a minute and a half I stood in the middle of a fight I could not have influenced with artillery. What stopped it was Kest. The 2 who had carried him set the litter down in the middle of the draw, in the open, between the 2 sides, and stepped back from it. He could not stand. He could not speak. He lay on his side on that hide with his ruined face turned up and one hand curled shut, and he made no attempt to be anything but what he was. Osra Fen walked out and stood beside him and said, loud enough for the whole draw, "This is the one who set the poison at Vesper Draw. This is his name, and this is my mother's name, and I carried the tins. He is yours. Take him now or take him after. But the dead is on this stick, and I am not going to pretend any more that it isn't." She held the willow stick up. Ushin crossed the draw. He stood over Kest for a long, long time, and the whole world went quiet, and I could hear the creak under the ice. Then he said, "After." And Vel said, "Why after?" And Ushin said, "Because I want more than one of them." They agreed to move together for 1 season. That was all. Not peace. Not friendship. A season. If either side broke it, everything went back on the sticks with interest, and Ushin made one more condition, and he made it while looking directly at me. "The poison came from a human trapline," he said. "The tins had a man's name on them. Somebody set that cache, and somebody sold that poison, and somebody drew the map that put a road up this draw." He put a hand on my shoulder, and I want you to imagine the weight of that. "When this is finished, if we are alive, you will answer for the human part." I said, "After." He said, "After," and took his hand off me, and that was the alliance. I had, at that point, 1 rifle with 5 rounds, a recorder with 1/5 of a battery, a dead man's notebook, a dog, and about 110 of the most dangerous creatures in North America who had agreed not to kill each other until spring. And somewhere out east, something enormous had tied a bell into my dog's fur and gone away without saying why. We went east in the last week of January in 3 groups moving on separate lines, and I learned in the first week that everything I thought I knew about traveling in that country was the slow version. The ledger moved at night in single file, in silence, covering 50 miles between dark and dark, with 2 out front and 2 behind and a rotation, so nobody was ever tired at the point. The dogmen moved in daylight, in a broad front, loud, because they did not care who heard them, and they could smell a 2-day-old track through a foot of new snow. They were not better or worse than each other. They were built for 2 different jobs and had spent 400 years insisting that the other job wasn't real work. I rode where I could and walked where I couldn't and slept about 4 hours a night, and Bishop stayed at my heel the entire way. The second message came on the 9th of February. I woke because the bell moved. Bishop had his head up and one ear turned, and the little brass thing behind his ear went tick, and I sat up in the dark, and about 15 feet from where I lay there was something arranged on the snow. 29 small stones in 4 rows. Beside them, 1 stone by itself, larger, set apart. Beside that, a spruce twig broke into a length and laid pointing north-northeast. I sat there for an hour, trying to make it be nothing. 29 in 4 groups. 1 separate and bigger. A direction. I went and got Osra, and she looked at it and said, "How many did my runners count in the nests below the ice?" Tovar said, 29 or 30. Nobody had slept in the same camp as me. Nobody had come within 400 yards. The dogmen had a picket out, and the ledger had 2, and something had walked through all of it and knelt down and made rows. Ushin came over and looked at the stones, and then he crouched and put his hand flat next to a print that had been left, deliberately, off to one side of the arrangement, the way a man signs a letter. 16.5 inches. He said 1 word in his own language, and Vel said the same word, and Osra said it too in hers, which is the only time I ever heard the 2 peoples agree on a name for anything. Ushin said to me in English, "That one carries for the tall thing. My scouts have seen it walking behind it. 3 times. I said, "Then why is it leaving me account of its own army?" And he said, "That is what I would like to know before I open it up." From then on it came about every 9 days. It never showed itself. It left things. Stones, twigs, bones. Once a line of ash laid on a flat rock in a shape that took me 2 hours to recognize as the shape of the ice at the head of the Sarazin with a passage marked. It left a caribou scapula scratched with tally marks in 3 groups. It left, in the middle of February, a strip of red flagging tape, the kind Cordwain surveyors used, tied around a stick and pushed into the snow beside a scratched circle. That one meant the substation. It knew about the substation. It knew I knew about it. And every single time, before the sign, the bell in Bishop's fur would tick once, and Bishop would put his ears up and his tail would go, and he would not bark. He never once barked at it. That old dog had bitten 2 men in his life, and he would not raise his voice at that thing. And I decided fairly early that Bishop was a better judge of character than I was. We started the war with fire, because fire was the one thing they had no answer to. They dried meat. That was the piece nobody expected. Under the roof trails and back in the caches there were racks. Actual racks, poles lashed with sinew, hung with strips of caribou and moose taken off that slaughter in October and cured in the cold and the smoke of green fires they kept low and constant. They were not eating it, and they were not eating much of anything, but the young ones were, and the malformed ones were, and something was. On the 11th of February we burned 9 cache sites and 6 drying grounds in one night, up and down 40 miles of the fence, for teams, with a jelly Osra's people made out of rendered fat and river silt that stuck to a pole and burned wet. It worked perfectly. That was the problem. It worked perfectly, and it taught them we existed. 3 days later we found the execution ground. It was in a bowl below the fence, about 4 acres, and they had cleared it down to bare ground, which in February means somebody had moved 4 acres of snow by hand. There were 61 posts in it. On 11 of them were dogmen. They had been there different lengths of time. Ushin walked that line, and did not make a sound, and did not let anybody walk it with him, and when he came back to us he had a piece of woven rope in his fist that he never afterward let go of. On 9 of them were Wendigos. That was the thing that changed the shape of the war for me. Their own. Gray, old, heavy in the shoulder. The last of the ones who had lived under the Long Father. The ones who remembered a different order. And they had been put on posts by the new one for whatever counted as disobedience. One of them still had a stone tool tied to its wrist. Another one, the oldest, had been arranged carefully with its hands crossed, which nothing on those posts had except that one, and I have always thought somebody who loved it did that at risk. They were not a monster. They were a country with a bad king. That is not a comfort. It made everything worse. You can shoot a monster. And on the 41st post was Odette Lorne's coat. It was on one of the sewn-eyed ones, the arrangers, which had been executed with the rest, and it had her coat pulled over its shoulders like a shawl, and I cut it off with my knife with my hands shaking so hard I opened my own thumb. She had written inside the lining in grease pencil. Small, controlled, the handwriting of somebody who has decided to be useful for the last 4 hours of their life. It said, "They keep me to talk to it. It learns fast. Tell them the tone is for the handler, not the animal. It will not come to sound. It will come to anger." I read that in a bowl full of posts, and I did not understand it for 9 days. There was a pit at the low end of the bowl, roofed with poles, and grass pulled the poles off it. There were dogs in it. 11 sled dogs from 4 different teams. Lake's team out of Chilliwack Bend, a village team from Nettle, 2 I didn't know, and 1 small cream-colored bitch with a chewed collar who came up off the floor of that pit screaming when she heard my voice. Halfpenny had been in that hole since the 26th of November. 81 days. She had a foot missing off the front left, taken cleanly, and it had healed, and she had teeth marks all over her that were not from other dogs. They had been feeding them. That's the thing I cannot get out of my head. There were bones in that pit, and there was water in a hollowed log, and they had been keeping 11 dogs alive under poles for 3 months, and I do not know why, and the 2 explanations I've come up with are both worse than not knowing. For of the 11 were too far gone. Vel did those quickly out of sight, which I did not expect from her, and which changed how I saw her. The other 7 came with us. Penny walked 11 miles that first night on 3 legs, and then let grass carry her, which is how a dog that had bitten every human being she ever met decided that a 9-foot creature with a jaw like a bear trap was acceptable. She rode on his shoulder for the rest of the war. He never commented on it. Bishop met her at the top of the bowl, and the 2 of them stood nose to nose for a while, and then went on together like the whole preceding 81 days were a paperwork error. That was the 9th of February through the 14th, and it was the high water mark, and I let myself believe we were winning for about a week. The failed attack was on the 21st. The plan was mine, and it was not stupid, and I have had a long time to think about that distinction. We would go at the mouth of the ice caves at the head of the Saracen, at night, with the ledger driving from above and the dogmen holding the throat of the moraine, and we would break whatever came out and then flood the entrance with fire and smoke and see what we could kill in the confusion. Osra thought we could take 40 of them for a cost of 6 or 8. Everything about the approach was right. Everything about the timing was right. They were not in the caves. They were on the moraine, above the dogmen, in the dark, at a strength of something like 90, which was 3 times the count on the ash map, and they had been in position long enough to be snowed over. I have gone through it 100 times looking for the leak, and I found it, and it was not the one anybody wanted it to be. We lost 19 that night. Vel was one of them. She died holding the left of the throat with about 11 others against a push that should have gone through her in a minute, and did not go through her for 11. And when I got to that part of the line afterward, there were 4 dead Wendigos in a heap in front of where she'd stood, and one of them was a kind I had not seen before, narrow, fast, with its hands worn down to bone points and hardened, a specialist, a thing that had been made or trained for nothing but reaching into a body. Osrafen took a piece of ice in the hip and never afterward moved without a limp. Tovar carried her 4 miles. And when we regrouped in the timber at dawn, Ushin came across the camp and put Grast and 2 others on either side of me and said, "Only 3 of us knew the hour. You, her, me." I said, "That isn't true, and you know it isn't. Every runner knew by dusk." He said, "Then it is one of yours or one of mine, and if it is one of mine, I will bring you his head myself." It was Rel. He was 19. His sister had been taken off a hunting line in the fall of the year, before by something none of them had been able to track, and she had never been found, and he had spent a year not sleeping. 3 weeks before the attack, his sister started talking to him from the timber at night. He told us all of it in the end, and he told it badly, in pieces, with his hands over his face. It had been so careful. It never asked him for anything. It said it was hurt. It said it was being kept somewhere. It said if he would only tell it where the pack was going to be, so that it could stay out of the way and not be caught in it, then maybe when this was all over. He gave it 2 hours of our timetable to keep his dead sister from being somewhere dangerous. The Skinwalker did not need to break a strong man. It found the one who was already broken, and it was patient with him. Ushin wanted him killed in front of both peoples, and Osra Fen, who had lost her hip and 11 of her own, agreed with him. I fought them both for 2 hours and lost, and I want to be honest and say that a part of me was glad to lose, because 19 were dead and Vel was dead, and somebody had to be at the bottom of that, and it could not be me. Osra did it herself because it was hers to do, and she made him look at her while she did it. Afterward, she sat down in the snow and put her hand over her eyes. She said, "Now they know we can be spoken to." The alliance came apart on the 27th of February, and it came apart because of a place called the Wailing Cut. The cut is a slot canyon about 2 miles long that carries a creek down off the north side of the Vashik, and in a hard freeze the wind coming through it makes a noise you can hear 4 miles off. And that is where the name comes from, and I have never liked it, and I have never needed to go through it. On the 24th, the bell moved. I found the sign at first light, 16 stones in a curve, and at the end of the curve a piece of charred spruce laid across the line, and beside it a bent willow wand set into the snow with its tip pointing down into a hole scratched in the crust. Osra read it before I did. She said, "The nests are moving into a hole. Here." She put her finger on the charred stick. "This is fire. This is the burned caches. They are moving because we burned them, and they are going here." Tovar walked the curve of stones with his hands behind his back and said, "That is the cut." We argued for 2 days. Ushin wanted it. He had lost his sister and 11 on posts, and he wanted a hole with something in it. Osra didn't like the ground and said so, and then agreed anyway, because after Rel she could not afford to look like she was holding back. I said we should send 4 and look. I was overruled by both of them, which was the only time they ever agreed on anything without me in the middle. 80-some of us went into the Wailing Cut on the 27th of February at 3 in the afternoon. There was nothing in it. There was nothing in it for a mile and a half, and then the top of the canyon started coming down. Not an avalanche. Rock. They had spent, I would guess, 11 days carrying stone up onto both rims and stacking it in cribs of frozen deadfall, and when we were strung out through the narrowest section they kicked it in on us from 200 feet up, and then they came down the scree behind it. We lost 22 in about 9 minutes, and it would have been all of us except that Grast found a chimney on the north wall and held the bottom of it by himself while 60 of us went up it, and I have never seen anything like what he did in that chimney, and I was too busy climbing to watch most of it. He came up last with his left arm hanging, and his jaw broken, and Penny still clinging to the sling on his back, and he lived another 6 weeks, and then he didn't. When we got out of that canyon and counted, Ushin came to me across the snow with his hands open, which for them is worse than coming with your hands closed. He said, 16 stones. I said, I know. 16 stones and a burned stick and a hole in the ground, and 80 of us walked into it. He crouched down so he was under my eye line, which is a thing they do to make you understand that they are not going to be argued with. The thing that leaves you those stones walks behind the tall one. My scouts have seen it. Osra's scouts have seen it. It has been counted 3 times standing at that animal's shoulder like a servant. And you have taken its word 4 times, and I have let you, because it was right 4 times, and now it is wrong once, and there are 22 of us under that rock. Osra Fen said, from where she was sitting with her bad hip, he's right, Eli. I said, give me until the moon changes. Ushin said, I will give you until I find it, and then I will open it up, and we will see what falls out. Here is what I could not tell them, because I did not know it yet. The Wailing Cut was not a mistake, and it was not a betrayal. It was a bill, and it was paid on the 2nd of March. On the 2nd of March, Tovar's runners came in from the east and reported that the ice caves at the head of the Sarazin were empty. Not lightly held. Empty. Between the 25th of February and the 1st of March, something on the order of 70 Wendigos had moved north out of that complex and had gone over the divide into the nettled drainage, and they had built there, and they were dug in above the cut on both rims, waiting for us to come back and try again. They had gone to defend the place where we had just been ambushed. Because they thought we would. Because something had told them we would. I sat down on a windfall and worked it out with a stick in the snow while Tovar and Osra watched me, and when I had it I laughed out loud once, which frightened all of them. It had sold us. That was true. It had sold the cut to Ren, and Ren had sold it to the king, and 22 of us had died to make it credible, and the price of that credibility was that 70 of the enemy were now sitting in a canyon 80 miles from where the war was actually going to happen. It had spent our dead to buy the king's army. It had not asked me. There was no way to ask me. If I had known, I would have moved us differently, and the trap would have been thin, and Ren would have smelled it, and the 70 would have stayed where they were. I understood in that moment that I had been working for 2 months alongside something that had made a decision about acceptable losses, and that whatever it was not on our side. It was on its own side, and its side and mine happened to be pointed at the same thing. I did not tell Osra, and I did not tell Ushin. Not then. If I had told them, then they would not have believed me, and if they had believed me, they would have hated it more, not less. I told them a different truth, which was that the head of the Saracen was empty, and that the king was down to an escort. 11 or 12. That was the count that came in over the next 3 days, from Tovar's runners and from the stones. The great animal, 4 or 5 of the reaching kind, 2 haulers, 2 arrangers, and a pair of its own malformed young that went everywhere with it, and that nobody could look at for long. 12, against nearly 60 of us. And we still could not kill it, and I want to be plain about why, because people always assume that with numbers you can take anything. We had tried. On the 8th of March, Ushin took 19 and hit the escort in the open on the outwash below the glacier, at dusk, on ground that favored him, and it went about as badly as a thing can go. The king picked up a dogman called Warwick, 190 pounds of him, and used him as a club on 2 others. It took rifle fire, spearwood, and 40 minutes of the best fighting I ever hoped to see, and at the end of it we had killed 1 hauler and 1 of the reaching kind and lost 7, and it walked back up onto the glacier and went into the melt pool to cool off. It cooled for 11 minutes. Tovar timed it with my watch. That 11 minutes was the whole war, and I did not understand it until I read Odette's coat for the 9th time. Tell them the tone is for the handler, not the animal. They had conditioned it with sound from the first month of its life. Pain and a 2-tone signal, over and over, in a concrete room. And any animal you do that to will learn to lie down for the sound, right up until the day it works out that the sound never heard it. A person heard it. A person with a recorder in his hand and a switch under his thumb. It will not come to sound. It will come to anger. 6 years in the wild, and there was still one thing in that creature that was not strategy, and was not appetite, and was not the long cold plan it had for the whole of Alaska. There was a room, and a man, and a noise. If I played that tone where it could hear me, it would not lie down. It would come and find whoever was holding the box. That was my part. That was the only part one ever had. I laid the whole thing out on a flat rock with a stick of charcoal on the 11th of March, and it took me 3 hours, and here is what it came to. 41 miles from the head of the Saracen, south and west, over one low divide and down the Rennet side, there is a bench above a burning coal seam where snow will not lie and steam comes up out of the moss in February. A thing that has to shed heat cannot shed it there. There is no cold ground to lie on, and there is no ice, and the creek that runs through it runs warm all winter and stinks of sulfur. And a thing that weighs what that thing weighed cannot cross the middle of that bench, because the crust over the burn in the middle is 9 inches of baked clay over a hole 100 feet deep with fire at the bottom. I know where the thin plate is. I know it to the yard. I have known it for 9 years, because I stood at the edge of it with a shovel and could not put my brother in it, and had to carry him another 200 feet to ground that would hold. So 41 miles. Not a chase. It runs faster than anything alive, and it does not stop. 41 miles of relay, in stages, over 2 days, with nearly 60 creatures peeling its escort off at a piece at a time, and me out in front of it with a cracked orange box. playing a second and a half of noise every time it started to lose interest. Osrafen said it was the worst plan she had ever heard. Ushan said it was not a plan, it was a fishing trip, and he was going to be on the end of the line. Then Kest asked to speak. He had not spoken in 20 years. He got about 9 words out over the better part of an hour, in his own tongue, with Tovar bent down next to him translating, and he had to stop twice. What he said was this: they need a beginning. Somebody must be at the ice when it comes out of the water. Somebody it will want. Carry me. Ushan went and stood over the litter for a long time, the same as he had at Vesper Draw. Then he said, "You do not owe me this." And Kest, who had not spoken in 20 years, said in English, "Oh." We carried him 41 miles the wrong way, up onto the moraine above the melt pool at the head of the Sarazin Glacier, on the night of the 14th of March, and we set him down on the ice in the open where a thing coming up out of cold water would see him first, and we left him there, and he raised his one good hand and did not look back at us. At 3 in the morning the king came out of the water. Kest made a noise up there that I have never heard from any animal in my life, and that I hope you never do. It went on for a long time. It was not fear. It was a 19-year-old carrying tins of poison down a draw in 1978, and it was every year since, coming out of him at once, at the top of his voice, on purpose, at the only audience that had ever deserved it. He held that animal's whole attention for 4 minutes. 4 minutes was the escort. In 4 minutes, the rest of us went through 11 of them on that moraine in the dark, and when it turned around, the king of the Wendigos was standing on a glacier with 2 of the reaching kind and its own 2 children, and everything else it owned was 80 miles north in a canyon full of wind. I stood up on the ridge above it with the recorder in my bare hand. I could see it down there in the steam off its own back, holding what was left of Kest. And I pressed the switch. The tone is a second and a half long. 2 notes, the second one lower, with a flutter in it like a bad speaker. It is an ugly little sound. In a kitchen you would think the refrigerator was dying. Across 400 yards of glacier at 3 in the morning, it went off that ice like a gunshot. Everything on the moraine stopped moving. The king put Kest down. It stood up to its full height and turned its head, and the steam coming off it changed direction, and it looked up at the ridge, at me, and for 1 second I saw the whole of it. 6 years in the wild, a concrete floor, a chilled slab, a man in a coverall with a box in his hand, and a thing in a cage that could not reach him. Then it came, and it did not go around the moraine, it went through it, and it knocked one of its own children 11 feet into a crevasse getting to the slope. Tovar picked me up and ran. I did not run 41 miles. I want that clear, because people build me up when I tell this, and I have watched them do it. I was carried. I lay along the back of a creature twice my weight with my arms around its neck and my face in its ruff and the recorder in my fist, and every mile or so somebody else took me without either of them breaking stride, and I was passed down that country like a bucket at a fire. The battery gave me 6 plays. I had used 1 on the glacier. I counted the rest out loud every time. 2 at the head of the outwash, when it slowed to check a side draw. 3 at the Nettle Crossing, where the Dogmen took one of the reaching kind off it in the willows and lost 2 of theirs doing it. 4 at first light, on the divide, when it stopped for the first time and stood swaying with its hands on its knees like a runner, and every inch of it was streaming, and it lay down in a drift, and the drift went to water underneath it in seconds, and it got up and came on. That was when I knew it was going to work, and that was the worst hour of the whole 2 days, because until then I had been able to tell myself the plan was probably nonsense. 5 in the afternoon, in a wind that had turned around into the south. That wind nearly ruined everything. A March Chinook came up the Rennet side and put the temperature up 40 degrees in 6 hours, and by evening the snow was rotten, and there was water running under the crust everywhere, and the whole country was cooling itself off just fine. Thank you. And the animal behind me got stronger by the hour. Osrafen made the call. She sent 30 of hers around it in the dark and put them across the drainages to the north and the east, 3 deep, so that every time it tried to break off the line and get down to the flat, wet ground it found the ledger standing in it. And they did not fight it, they just refused to let it turn. That is the single most disciplined thing I have ever seen done by anything. 30 of them, spread over 11 miles, holding a line against something they could not kill all night, so that a 51-year-old man on somebody's back could keep it pointed south. At 4 in the morning on the 16th, at the bottom of the ridge below the lantern field, when it stopped and would not come any further, because it had begun to smell what was up there. That was the closest we came to losing it. It stood in the alders for 11 minutes with the steam boiling off it, and it would not step out onto that slope. It had worked it out. It had gone 6 years without a handler, and it had learned what a burning ground was, and it stood at the bottom of that hill and looked up and understood that it was being managed. So Ushin went down and heard it. That's all. He took 11 of his people down into the alders, and they went at it in the dark, and they made it bleed, and then they ran, and it forgot everything it had worked out, because the one thing they built into that animal that they could never take back out was that it could not stand to be defied. It came up over the ridge at first light on the 16th of March with 4 of us dead behind it, and there was nothing on the other side but 2 miles of black ground with steam coming out of it. You have to understand what that place looks like in March. Everything around it is white. You come up over the lip, and below you is a long, shallow bench the color of an old bruise, wet moss and dead willow and bare gravel, with white steam standing straight up out of 100 vents in the calm of the morning. There are places where the ground has slumped into pits. The creek runs through the middle of it, brown, warm, smoking. And it stinks. Sulfur and hot clay, and, underneath, the smell of a coal stove. It had been burning under there since before anybody wrote anything down. It is still burning now. The king came down onto that bench at a run, and by the time it was 200 yards out onto it, it was in trouble. There was nowhere to put the heat. The ground under it was warm. The air was warm. The creek was warm. It had run 41 miles in a chinook at the top of its capacity, and now it was standing in a 2-mile pan with a fire under it, and its skin began to split. I watched it happen from 180 yards. It came apart across the shoulders and down the back, long straight openings, and steam came out of them, and it stopped and turned around twice like a dog looking for a cold spot. Then it saw me. I was standing on the far side of the thin plate. It is about 40 feet across, and the ground there is a pale gray-yellow, baked hard, and it is completely flat and completely clean, and nothing grows on it. And if you kneel down on it, you can feel the heat come up into your knees. Underneath it is a void where the seam has burned out. I do not know how deep. I dropped a rock in it 9 years ago and did not hear it land. I had walked around it. I had walked the long way, through the willows, and I was standing on real ground on the other side with the recorder in my hand and Ushin, and 11 dogmen in the willows to my left, and Osra Fenn's people strung across the bench behind it. I played it a 7th time, and nothing happened because the battery was gone. That is not a dramatic flourish. That is what happened. I pressed the switch, and the little red light came up brown and went out, and I stood there holding a dead orange box in front of the worst thing in North America. So I threw it at the animal, and I called it by the name Cordwain gave it. I do not know why that worked, and I have never known. It should not have understood English. It should not have cared. But it had spent 4 years in a room where 2-legged things looked at it and said a word over and over on clipboards, at feeding, at testing, at every worst moment of its life, and when I shouted that word across 40 feet of baked clay, that creature came at me the way a bull comes through a fence. It did not go around. 9 inches of clay over a hole is a floor until it is not, and it went through at about the 4th stride, straight down, and the whole plate went with it in one piece, and the sound was not a crash. It was a soft, enormous cough, and a column of ash and sparks went up 80 feet in the calm air, and I was knocked flat by the heat of it. It caught the lip with one arm. It should not have been able to. It weighed what a horse weighs, and it had one hand on a crumbling edge of baked clay, and it hauled itself up until its chest was over the rim, and the old jawbone was still wired at its throat, and it got the other arm up. And that is when the Sasquatch came out of the willows. I had never seen it, all winter, and I had never once seen it. It went past me at a distance of maybe 15 feet at a heavy rolling run, and it was the better part of 9 feet, and it was dark red-brown with gray across the shoulders, and its arms swung with a weight that made everything else on that field look like it was made of sticks. Its face was not an ape's face, and it was not a man's. The eyes were very deep and very far apart, and there was nothing in them I could read then, and nothing I can read now. It did not go for the head or the arms. It went for the nape. It landed on that animal's back with both hands on the raised place under the skin at the base of the skull. The straight thing, The paperback-sized thing that Cordwain had put in there so a creature with a furnace in it could dump the heat, and it tore it out. It came away with a wet sound and about 4 feet of something behind it, and the Sasquatch fell backward off the king's shoulders with the thing in its hands, and the king made a noise then that I will not attempt to describe. Whatever heat that animal had left had nowhere to go and no way out. It went up like a stove with the flue closed. It came all the way out of the pit. That is the part nobody believes. It came all the way out, on fire from the inside, with light coming out of the splits in its back, and it stood up on the edge of that hole, and it looked at me. And it made the sound I heard once before, in a doorway at Substation 4, when it put its face down to mine, and breathed me in, and let me live. Ushan hit it from the left at a dead run. He took hold. That is how they fight, and it is the only way they fight, and he got both arms through and locked and put his head down against its chest, and he simply walked it backward, for steps 5, and he did not let go, and the edge of that pit was not ground anymore, it was ash. They went in together. I got to the rim, and there was nothing to see. A hole full of light and heat, and a wind going down into it, and Grass standing beside me with his broken arm, howling into it, and Osra Fen on her bad hip in the moss, and the survivors of 2 peoples who had spent 400 years hating each other standing on a burning bench in the sunrise, and not one of them moved for a long time. The Wendigo King burned in that seam for 11 days. You could see it from the ridge at night, an orange smudge on the underside of the steam. The seam is still burning. It will be burning long after everybody in this story is gone. Ren was still out there, and everybody knew it, and for 4 days nobody said the word out loud. Then the bell moved for the last time. It was the 20th of March, and I was sitting on the bench above the burn with my back against a rock, and Bishop, who had been brought up from the rear camp 2 days before and had not left my legs since, put his ears up, and the little brass thing behind his ear went tick. There was a piece of red flagging tape tied around a willow 40 feet away, and under it, scratched in the wet gravel, a rough oval with a line running into it, and 2 marks at the end of the line. The Dunlap mine. The upper adit and the lower one. 6 miles of grade with alders through it, and a rusted steam donkey at the top with 200 feet of cable on the drum, and a man named Wade Caswell had hung in a tree at the top of that road in November for 4 hours. It had kept its depository under the place where it did its best work. We went in on the 22nd with Osra Fen, Tovar, Grass with his arms strapped to his chest, 9 of the Ledger and 11 Dogmen, and we did not go in the front. We went in the lower adit with lamps, up a drift half full of ice, and we came out into a stope about the size of a church. I am not going to describe all of it. I'll describe enough. They were on frames. Somebody had made frames out of split spruce and mined timber, dozens of them, and on each one a person's outside was stretched and dried and kept. Faces mostly. Hands. The front of a chest with a tattoo on it. They were arranged along the walls in an order, and the order was by age, oldest and driest at the back, and the back of that room went a long way. There were 41 frames. I found Gil. I found Silas Doone's face and Silas Doone's hands, both of them, laid out with the fingers spread. I found Odette. I found a state trooper's uniform shirt with the name tape still on it, and I recognized the name, and he had gone missing in 2011 out of Chilliwack Bend, and there had been a search that ran 2 weeks. And near the front, on the newest frame, with the spruce still green, Tobin Sorrow, 24 years old, who I had not been able to pull out of the ice. Grass set the fires. It took an hour to get it going, and then it went, and we came out of that adit ahead of the smoke and stood on the grade in the dark and watched the mountain breathe orange out of 2 holes. Ren came at about 4 in the morning. It came up the road in Anders' shape. My brother was 33 when he died, and he had a way of walking with one hand in his coat pocket, and he came up that road at a normal pace with one hand in his coat pocket, and about 30 feet out he stopped and said, "Eli, hey, what did you do?" I had my rifle on him. 5 rounds still. I had not fired it since December. He said, "You don't need that. It's me. Look at me." He said, "You left me on that ridge." And that is the thing that nearly finished me, because it was true, and because it was said in exactly the tone Ander would have used, which was not angry. Ander was never angry. He would have said it, and then he would have laughed and made it all right, and I stood in the road with a rifle up and waited for him to laugh, because if he laughed I did not know what I was going to do. It did not laugh. It could not. That is where they always fail. It had every word, and it never once had the shape of the thing between the words. Osrafen came out of the alders behind it, and Tovar came out of the alders on the other side, and it turned to run, and Grast was in the road, and it stopped. And then it came apart. I don't know a better way to say it. Everything it was wearing sloughed. Whatever it had taken off my brother's memory and worn on the outside was tied to that room in the mountain, and the room was burning, and it went from a man in a coat to something crouched in the snow in about 4 seconds, and what was left was small. That is what I was not ready for. It was small. It came up to about my chest. It was gray and it was smooth, and there was a seam down the middle of the front of its head where a face would go, and its hands were long and fine and shaking, and it had no hair on it anywhere and nothing on it that would hold heat for 10 minutes at 20 below. It had been going into people's camps for 200 years, and it had never once had a body that could survive a night out. It made a sound, and the sound came out in my own voice, because I was the closest living thing to it. It said, Eli. It said, Eli, don't. Ushan was dead, and Vel was dead, and Gil and Booker and Odette and Tobin and Nadine and Silas, and so many of my dogs were dead, and I stood over that shivering thing in the road with a rifle, and what I wanted was not to shoot it. What I wanted, and I am telling you this because I promised myself I would tell all of it, was to take it back. Alive. In a box. I had already worked out how. A fuel drum with holes punched in it, and a chain, and a place I knew. I wanted it to have a room. I wanted it to have a floor and a door, and a noise that meant somebody was coming. I stood there and built the whole thing in my head in about 10 seconds, and it was a good plan, and it was Cordwain's plan, exactly and precisely, down to the last detail, and I had thought of it without effort. Osrafen said quietly, Eli. I said, I know. She said, that is how the other one was made. I put the rifle down. We left it in the road. That's all. We walked back down the grade and left it sitting in the snow at 4 in the morning at 19 below with the mountain burning behind it, and it followed us for about 1.5 miles, calling, in my voice, and then in Osra's, and then in Grast's, and then in a child's, and then it stopped following. I do not know exactly when it died. I know that we went back up in April, and there was a shape in the melting snow at the side of the road, curled up small, with its long fine hands over the seam where its face should have been. That is the only mercy anybody got that year, and I am not sure it was one. The ledger went into that winter with 91, and came out with 57. The Dogman of Vesper Draw lost 31, including Ushan, and Grast 6 weeks later from the arm. Osrafen burned the Vesper Draw stick in front of both peoples in April, and the young one who came up after Ushan, a hard, quiet female called Hone, let her, and then walked a boundary with her that took 9 days, and that boundary is still there. They are not friends. They will never be friends. But there has not been a killing between them since, and the ledger's young now learned to say 2 words in the other language, which are the words for water and for stop. That is what 104 dead, on every side, bought. A line on the ground and 2 words. I have decided it was worth it. Most days. The Sasquatch did not leave with us. When the field went quiet, it walked down to the edge of the pit, and went in as far as it could stand the heat, and it came back up with the old jawbone. The cable had burned off it. It was black and cracked, but it was whole. It carried that jaw north for 3 days, and I followed it, and it let me, and neither of us made any attempt to close the distance. At the head of the Saracen, it went up into the ice caves where Cordwain had taken a young one out with a bait line in 2009, and where the long father had died in 2013. It dug a hole in the gravel at the back with its hands, and put the jaw in it, and covered it, and sat down beside it. There are marks on the wall of that cave. Hundreds of them, in 3 sizes, going back further than I want to guess, and 11 of them are recent, and one of them has a shape beside it that could be a bell. It had been with the old one. That's all I have ever been able to work out, and it is all I need. Whatever that country had in the way of an order, before Cordwain put a torch to a set of 4-inch bars, it had been part of it. It had watched a thing out of a laboratory kill the last of that order, and then wear its jaw around its neck for 6 years, and it had gone and stood at that thing's shoulder for those same 6 years, counting its army and learning when it had to go into the water, and it had let 22 of my allies die in a canyon to buy the last piece of it. It never asked us for anything. It never took anything. It never made a sound in front of me all winter. When I finally came close, at the mouth of that cave, in the flat light, it stood up. And it stepped back. It had put its hands in my dog's fur while I slept 40 miles from anybody. It had knelt 11 feet from my head to lay out stones. And on the last day, in the daylight, with nothing left to hide, it would not let me within 30 feet of it, and it kept its eyes on me the whole time I backed away. I told myself for a long while that it was just being careful. They found Tobin Sorrow in the 3rd week of April, 41 miles downriver, in the sweeper at the head of a slough, and the cold had kept him more or less as he was. His gloves had been taken off and folded and set on his chest. Nobody did that. He went under the ice with them on. I put them on him myself that morning. I gave 4 statements. I gave the notebook, the folder, Odette's coat, and the dead recorder to 3 different agencies. The recorder came back to me in a padded envelope 11 months later with a letter saying no chain of custody could be established. The notebook and the folder did not come back at all. Rudy Voss told the troopers that he never flew that route and had never met me, and when I went to his hangar in Fairbanks in June he was polite, and he called me sir, and he did not once look at my face. Cordwain Applied Ecology dissolved in the autumn of that year. Its assets were acquired by a partnership out of Nevada, and if you go looking you will find that the partnership's registered agent has an address that is the same office suite as an environmental consultancy that holds 3 federal survey contracts in the interior right now. I am not going to say I know what that means. I will say I noticed it. Delia Hobbs, the trooper who showed me the photograph of the moose, put in for a transfer to Ketchikan 2 years later. She sent me a card at Christmas for 4 years, and then she stopped. Bishop lived to 15. Penny made it another 6 years on 3 legs and died in her sleep on the floor of my kitchen with her head on a boot. I still have the bell. Here is the last thing, and then I'm finished. I got my 2nd shot in November. Caswell was dead by the date it was scheduled, and the ampoules were in his pack, and Gil Prater gave it to me himself on the 19th of November, because Gil was the medic and it was on the schedule, and both of us were too tired to ask a single question about it. There was a hard little knot under the skin of my left shoulder for about 2 years. It is not there now. I have looked. There's nothing to find. There's not even a scar. I came out of that country weighing 131 pounds, and I have never gotten it back, and I eat like a horse. My doctor in Fairbanks has run everything there is to run, and tells me I am the healthiest 58-year-old he has. And last winter I sat out on my steps at 31 below in a work shirt for an hour and a half without noticing, and my neighbor came over and asked me if I was all right. I told him I'd lost track of the time. The thing at the substation put its face down next to mine and breathed me in and let me live, and on the burning ground, on fire, with its back opened up and my brother's grave under its feet, it turned around and looked at me and made that same sound. And the Sasquatch, which had walked into my camp in the night and touched my dog, would not let me stand near it in daylight. Bishop stopped sleeping in my room in his last 2 years. He would go to the doorway and lie down facing me with his head on his paws, all night, every night, and he would not come in, and he would not look away, and when I called him he'd wag his tail and stay exactly where he was. He was the best dog I ever had, and he knew me better than anyone alive. I am still hungry.